Drive north out of Morganton, North Carolina, on Highway 181, and at mile marker 20 you'll find a small pull-off with a historical sign and a clear view across Linville Gorge toward a modest, unremarkable ridge called Brown Mountain. On the right night, dark, clear, no moon, people standing at that exact spot have reported watching a glowing orb rise silently from the tree lean, hover, drift, sometimes split into multiple lights, and fade away. This isn't a fringe claim from a handful of unreliable witnesses. It's one of the most consistently, publicly documented unexplained phenomena in American history, investigated twice by the United States Geological Survey. Studied for years by a state university using scientific camera equipment, covered by National Geographic, and reported continuously by ordinary people for well over a century, stretching back, according to some accounts, considerably longer than that. Here's what makes the Brown Mountain Lights genuinely different from most stories in this genre: the government didn't ignore it. They investigated multiple times. Each time, officials announced a confident, specific, scientific explanation. And each time, the lights kept appearing anyway, on schedule, in front of witnesses, long after the case had supposedly been closed. Brown Mountain itself is, by any ordinary geological standard, almost aggressively unremarkable, a modest ridge in the Pisgah National Forest, part of Burke County. Rising nowhere near the dramatic heights of nearby peaks, covered in unremarkable Appalachian hardwood forest. With no particular geological feature that would obviously mark it as the site of a century-plus of persistent, well-documented anomalous light reports. That ordinariness is, in its own way, part of what makes the case genuinely interesting to researchers rather than easily dismissed. This isn't a site already primed for mystery through some dramatic natural feature or pre-existing folklore tradition inviting embellishment. It's an unremarkable ridge that, for reasons still not fully agreed upon, happened to become the specific fixed point where witness after witness, across generation after generation, kept looking up and seeing something they couldn't explain. Solution number 1. It's just train headlights. The first serious government investigation came in 1913, when a U.S. Geological Survey scientist examined witness reports and proposed a straightforward, entirely reasonable explanation. The lights were simply the headlights of locomotives traveling through the valley below. Their beams distorted and made to appear as floating orbs by atmospheric conditions and the specific angle of the surrounding terrain. It was a good theory. It was also, within just a few years, directly contradicted by the exact kind of evidence that should have settled the matter conclusively. In 1916, catastrophic regional flooding washed out significant sections of the railroad tracks running through the valley, halting train service in the area for an extended period. If the lights really were nothing more than misidentified train headlights, removing the trains entirely should have made the phenomenon stop immediately and completely. It didn't. Witnesses continued reporting the lights throughout the period the track sat washed out and unusable, a detail that should have been the theory's death sentence. Instead, remarkably, the train explanation continued circulating in popular retellings for years afterward, repeated by people who either didn't know about the flood, or who simply found it's a well-known, settled mystery, more satisfying to repeat than the official 1913 explanation had already been disproven within 3 years of being announced. There's a deeper irony buried in the 1913 investigation's timing worth pointing out directly. Witness reports of unusual lights near Brown Mountain predate the arrival of significant rail infrastructure in the immediate area by a meaningful margin. According to several later researchers who've tried to reconstruct the earliest layer of the phenomenon's history. If some documented sightings genuinely occurred before there were enough operating trains in the valley to produce the volume and consistency of headlight sightings being reported, the original 1913 theory faced a chronological problem baked in from the very start, quite apart from the 1916 flood that would go on to undermine it further just a few years later. Solution number 2. We sent a government scientist to prove it's nothing. Public interest hadn't faded by 1922, so the U.S. Geological Survey tried again, this time sending geologist George R. Mansfield to conduct what remains, to this day, the most thorough official scientific investigation the phenomenon has ever received. Mansfield's methodology was genuinely rigorous for its era. Working with local observers. He used a topographic map and a precision surveying instrument called an alidade telescope to plot the exact compass bearing of each reported light sighting from multiple separate observation points, allowing him to triangulate roughly where in the valley the light sources were actually originating from, rather than relying on witness impressions of an object's apparent location relative to the mountain itself. His official published report, released to the press in 1922 and later reproduced in full within a U.S. Geological Survey circular, concluded that the overwhelming majority of reported sightings could be explained by a combination of ordinary sources: automobile headlights on distant roads, locomotive headlights, distant town and city lighting becoming increasingly common as regional electrification expanded, and brush fires. With all of these mundane light sources becoming visually distorted, magnified, and made to appear as floating, colored orbs through a well-documented atmospheric effect called mirage refraction, in which temperature layering in the air bends and stretches distant light sources in ways that can make them appear to move, change color, or hover independent of their actual, fixed origin point. For a genuinely significant stretch of time, Mansfield's report functioned as the accepted, mainstream, government-sanctioned explanation, and it wasn't unreasonable for it to. Regional electrification had, in fact, been expanding rapidly through exactly this period, dramatically increasing the number of distant artificial light sources visible from elevated viewpoints across the valley in a way that hadn't existed a generation earlier. The methodology was sound. The conclusion was plausible. And for years, the case was treated by most reasonable observers as officially, scientifically closed. Except sightings never actually stopped. Witnesses continued reporting lights matching the same general description for decades afterward, including in locations and viewing conditions that made simple headlight or refraction explanations considerably harder to sustain, and including reports predating significant regional electrification and automobile traffic entirely, timelines that, if accurate, would place at least some historical sightings before there were enough cars or town lights in the valley for Mansfield's explanation to fully account for what people were describing. It's worth crediting Mansfield's investigation for exactly what it was, a genuinely careful, methodologically sound piece of early 20th century field science, conducted by a credentialed government geologist using the best available surveying tools of his era, and reaching a conclusion that was neither dismissive nor sensationalized. The problem wasn't the quality of his method. It was the durability of his conclusion against nearly 100 years of subsequent sightings his 1922 fieldwork simply had no way of accounting for in advance. Mansfield examined a snapshot of a phenomenon at one specific moment in a rapidly electrifying region, and reasonably explained a large share of what he was able to observe and document during his visit, while the phenomenon itself kept going, largely indifferent to how definitively the case had supposedly just been closed on his way back out of the valley. Solution number 3, ball lightning, piezoelectricity. And other science that still hasn't closed the file as the 20th century wore on and skepticism toward the original refraction theory grew. Researchers proposed a rotating cast of increasingly sophisticated scientific alternatives, none of which has managed to fully, conclusively account for every documented aspect of the phenomenon. Ball lightning, a genuine, if still not completely understood, atmospheric electrical phenomenon in which a glowing, floating sphere of plasma forms during certain thunderstorm conditions, has been proposed by several researchers as a possible natural explanation for at least some sightings. The theory has real scientific grounding. Ball lightning is a documented, if rare and still not fully explained, meteorological phenomenon in its own right. But it doesn't comfortably account for Brown Mountain sightings reported during clear, storm-free nights, which represent a significant share of the historical witness record. A separate theory has focused on the mountain's underlying geology, proposing that naturally occurring lithium-bearing mineral deposits within Brown Mountain itself might interact with humidity and atmospheric moisture to produce a form of piezoelectric or triboluminescent glow, light generated through mechanical stress or friction within certain crystalline mineral structures. A genuine, documented physical phenomenon observed in other geological contexts around the world. This theory remains, as of the most recent research summaries, unconfirmed and largely untested at the specific site, an intriguing hypothesis rather than an established explanation. Then, in the 2010s, Appalachian State University took the most sustained, technologically serious modern approach to the mystery yet. Installing dedicated low-light surveillance cameras with a direct sightline into the gorge, running continuously for years. Specifically to capture and analyze footage of any anomalous light activity under controlled, documented conditions. A 2014 report covering more than 6,300 hours of collected footage found nothing genuinely unexplainable within that specific dataset, a meaningful, credible null result. And then, in 2016, the same ongoing research effort captured footage of a stationary, unexplained light that researchers were unable to confidently attribute to any of the standard mundane explanations. Even the most rigorous, longest-running scientific monitoring effort in the phenomenon's entire history couldn't fully close the case. It simply added one more data point to a file that has now been explained and reopened repeatedly across more than a century. The sheer scale of that Appalachian State dataset deserves genuine appreciation on its own terms. 6,300 hours works out to well over 8 months of continuous, round-the-clock footage. Systematically reviewed by researchers specifically looking for exactly the kind of anomalous light activity this phenomenon is famous for producing. Finding nothing explainable across the overwhelming majority of that footage represents a genuinely useful negative result, strongly suggesting the lights are, at minimum, a rare occurrence rather than a nightly guarantee, which makes the single 2016 capture of a stationary, unattributable light all the more significant by comparison. In a dataset that large, producing even one genuinely puzzling result is a meaningfully different outcome than producing dozens, and it's precisely that scarcity, combined with persistence across more than a century of otherwise mundane nights, that keeps serious researchers from either fully dismissing the phenomenon or fully explaining it. No account of the Brown Mountain Lights is complete without the region's most beloved explanation, and, as it turns out, one of the clearest examples in this entire story of how quickly folklore and documented fact can become tangled together. According to the most widely repeated version of the legend, displayed for years on the official historical marker at the Brown Mountain overlook itself, the lights represent the spirits of Cherokee maidens, still searching the ridges by torchlight for warriors who died in a great battle fought against the Catawba people near Brown Mountain around 1200 AD. It's a genuinely moving story, and it's been repeated in tourist brochures, local news segments, and popular retellings for generations. Consistently framed as ancient Native American tradition predating European settlement in the region entirely. Here's the complication, laid out plainly by skeptical researcher Joe Nickel in a detailed investigative review published in Skeptical Inquirer. No verifiable historical record actually documents this specific Cherokee legend existing prior to the 20th century. According to Nickel's research, the earliest identifiable published claim connecting the lights to a Native American legend appeared in an Asheville newspaper article in 1938, meaning that ancient Cherokee legend, many people assume predates written American history by centuries may, in its most commonly told modern form, actually be a 20th century addition to the story, potentially blended with or built from other older regional ghost stories about a lost slave searching for a master, or a grieving woman wandering the mountain with a lantern. Stories that circulated in various forms in the decades before 1913 without necessarily being explicitly, formally tied to Cherokee tradition in any documented written source from that earlier period. This doesn't mean Cherokee and Catawba oral traditions about the mountain don't exist in some form. Oral tradition, by its nature, doesn't always leave behind the kind of written paper trail researchers like Nickel rely on. And dismissing an oral tradition simply because it wasn't published in a newspaper carries its own real limitations as a research method. But it does mean the specific, detailed 1200 AD battle narrative repeated on tourist signage and in countless retellings has a far more recent, and far more thoroughly documented paper trail than most people assume, a genuinely interesting case study, sitting right alongside the lights themselves. In how quickly a story can calcify into ancient legend status well within living memory. Nichols' research also traced an earlier layer of competing folklore that circulated in the years before the specific Cherokee-Catawba battle narrative became dominant. Including tales of a formerly enslaved man searching the ridges with a lantern for a master he'd lost track of during the chaos of wartime. And a separate story describing a heartbroken woman wandering the mountain at night, her light visible from the valley below as she searched in vain for a missing loved one. These competing, sometimes contradictory folk explanations suggest the phenomenon attracted explanatory legend building almost immediately once it entered wider public awareness in the early 1900s. With different storytellers reaching for whatever culturally resonant narrative felt most compelling at the time, and the Cherokee battle version. Whether rooted in genuine older oral tradition or assembled more recently from available cultural material, simply proved to be the version that stuck. What actually remains unexplained strip away everything that's been reasonably, credibly explained over the past century, and here's what's actually left sitting on the table. Multiple credible, non-fringe explanations, train and vehicle headlights, refracted distant lighting, ball lightning. And possibly mineral-based luminescence, almost certainly account for a meaningful share of historical Brown Mountain sightings. Particularly those reported during and after the region's rapid 20th-century electrification and road expansion. What none of these individual theories fully accounts for is the complete historical range of the phenomenon: sightings reported before significant regional electrification, sightings during clear, storm-free conditions inconsistent with ball lightning, and, as recently as 2016, footage captured by a dedicated, methodologically rigorous university research program that researchers themselves couldn't confidently attribute to any single one of the standard explanations. Each proposed solution has captured a genuine piece of the picture. None has captured the whole thing, across the entire 20th and 21st century historical record, cleanly enough to make every other proposed theory unnecessary. That's a genuinely unusual position for an American folklore phenomenon to occupy this far into the 21st century. Most unsolved regional mysteries either get definitively debunked once modern recording technology enters the picture, or they quietly fade from public sighting once the original conditions producing them change. Brown Mountain has done neither. It has survived 3 separate rounds of official, credentialed scientific investigation, spanning more than a century, each producing a partial, reasonable, evidence-based explanation, and each eventually running into sightings and data the explanation simply didn't fully cover. Part of what keeps the case genuinely open, rather than simply unresolved through neglect, is the sheer diversity and reasonable credibility of the witnesses involved across more than a century. This isn't a phenomenon sustained purely by anonymous internet forum posts or a handful of repeat enthusiasts. Reports have come from park rangers, university researchers conducting formal monitoring projects, local residents with decades of familiarity with the area's ordinary nighttime light sources, and casual tourists with no prior investment in the mystery one way or the other. That breadth of witness background doesn't prove anything supernatural is happening above Brown Mountain. But it does make the phenomenon considerably harder to wave away as simple mass misidentification by an unfamiliar or unreliable observer population. The way many similar regional light legends elsewhere in the country eventually are. The verdict: 3 official investigations. 3 confident, scientifically grounded explanations. 3 times, witnesses kept seeing the lights anyway, under conditions the previous explanation couldn't fully account for. A legend widely believed to stretch back centuries into Cherokee oral tradition, that the actual documentary paper trail suggests may be, in its most detailed modern form, barely older than the automobile. And, as recently as 2016, a stationary, unexplained light captured by university researchers running one of the most methodologically serious monitoring efforts this phenomenon has ever received. The Brown Mountain lights aren't a story about the government hiding something. If anything, it's almost the opposite, a story about a government agency investigating an ordinary regional light phenomenon not once, not twice, but repeatedly, in good faith. With real scientific method, and simply never quite managing to make the explanation stick permanently enough for the mountain to stop producing new sightings that don't fit. Have you ever seen something you couldn't explain, and had someone hand you a perfectly reasonable answer that somehow didn't quite cover everything you actually saw? Tell us about it in the comments, and if mysteries that keep surviving their own official explanations are exactly what you're here for, subscribe. Because Brown Mountain almost certainly isn't finished lighting up.